Brilliance Audio.
The Royal by Susan Stoker. Performed by C.J. Bloom and Jeremy York. Callum Redmon pulled his Rolls-Royce Cullinan into the Greens driveway on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Traffic had been terrible, and he'd arrived much later than he'd hoped. He was in an awful mood. His back hurt, his knees were throbbing, and he had a horrible headache. Ever since he'd been a POW and endured relentless torture, his body hadn't been the same. He felt as if he was at least 20 years older than his 37 years. The last place he wanted to be was here. He'd told his relatives that he wasn't a bodyguard, that ever since he'd gotten out of the military, he didn't want anything to do with covert operations or any kind of security. And yet, here he was. Being part of the Liechtenstein royal family wasn't easy. Even though he hadn't grown up in the tiny country, and even though he barely knew the Queen and King, he was still expected to be loyal, still expected to drop everything and do their bidding when they asked. So when Carla Green had told his second cousin, who she'd met online, that she was being stalked, his cousin had reached out to Cal to see what he could do about it. When Cal, being Cal, had told him he couldn't do anything about his latest online model friend's personal troubles, that she should call her local police, his cousin had ignored him. He'd talked to his mother, who'd talked to her sister, who'd spoken with the Queen. She, in turn, had called Cal's parents, and the next thing he knew, he was being guilted into driving to D.C. to investigate the situation. Cal wasn't qualified to do a damn thing about Carla's problem. Yes, he could shoot, was a damn good shot, in fact. But that didn't make him qualified to be some amateur investigator, and certainly not a bodyguard. He could barely handle his own body. Most days, his very bones hurt. The torture he'd received as a POW had screwed him up bad. Torn ligaments, broken bones, pulled muscles. Those were just the tip of the iceberg. Technically, all the injuries he'd sustained had healed, but the effects were ongoing, and his scars, inside and out, were many. Not only that, but since his release, Cal didn't particularly care for people in general. He was grumpy on the worst of days and standoffish on the best. He'd seen the worst humanity had to offer, and he much preferred to hole up in the house he'd bought in the small Maine town where he and his friends had settled after they'd gotten out of the military. Thanks to his royal lineage and parents who'd invested their family money carefully, Cal never had to worry about the size of his bank account. No one would know simply by looking at him that he had over $1 billion in his extensive portfolio. Most days he wore faded jeans and long-sleeve t-shirts, and he definitely didn't flaunt the fact that he had money, and lots of it. Yes, the Cullinan was obnoxiously expensive. No one needed a Rolls-Royce SUV. But he hadn't been able to resist. It was sleek, had all the bells and whistles, and most importantly, was excellent on the snowy roads of Maine. Most people would assume the vehicle was just another SUV like thousands of others on the road. It was covered in dirt and looked more like a work truck at the moment than a $300,000 vehicle. As instructed, Cal drove his SUV around the back of the fairly large house sitting on 5 acres and parked in the large paved area. He took a moment to reach for his phone to text JJ and let him know that he'd arrived at the Greens safe and sound. He'd call his friend later tonight and tell him what he'd learned after talking with Carla, but for now, after sending the brief text, he allowed himself a second to enjoy the silence that surrounded him. Closing his eyes, Cal took a deep breath. What he really wanted to do was turn around and drive right back to Maine, to hole up in his quiet house and be left alone.